The extinction weapons took 6 hours to charge, and Fleet Commander Vorath watched the countdown timer with a mixture of relief and shame. His soldiers were being evacuated from the surface as quickly as the dropships could carry them, and they were leaving behind fortified positions and captured territory, and the bodies of 340,000 of their comrades. They were also leaving behind a world that had refused to break. Vorath stood on the bridge of his flagship and stared at Earth through the view screen, and the planet looked peaceful from orbit with its blue oceans and green continents and swirling white clouds. In 6 hours, it would be a dead rock. Ambassador Yeon Sumin received the news in her quarters on Varanthos Prime, and she sat alone in the darkness for several long minutes before activating her communication console. She transmitted one final message to Earth Command. "They are going to destroy the planet," she said. "Make them remember us." The message was received by General Park Jin-ho in a bunker beneath the mountains of Gangwon Province, and he read the words 3 times before forwarding them to every resistance cell on the planet. Within minutes, the message had spread to every corner of Earth. "Make them remember us." Across the planet, humans emerged from bunkers and tunnels and basements, and they looked up at the sky where the Keth fleet hung like a swarm of metal locusts. They did not flee. They did not hide. They picked up their weapons and walked out into the open, and they waited for the end with their heads held high. A grandmother in Buenos Aires sat on her porch with a hunting rifle across her lap and watched the sunset. A teenage boy in Nairobi stood on a rooftop with a captured Keth pistol and practiced his aim on imaginary targets. A group of resistance fighters in Berlin gathered in a bombed-out church and sang songs that their great-grandparents had sung during another war a long time ago. If Earth was going to die, then it would die fighting. But the end did not come, Counselor. Myrith had watched the Keth charge their extinction weapons, and she had calculated the time remaining, and she had made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. Deploy the Veln observation fleet to Earth orbit. She commanded. Full visibility and broadcast our presence to every ship in the system. Her second-in-command stared at her with disbelief. "Counselor, if the Keth fire their weapons while our ships are in orbit, they will destroy us as well." "Yes, they will," Myrith replied. "That is the point." She opened a channel to the Galactic Council, and her bioluminescent skin blazed with colors that indicated absolute determination. "This is Counselor Myrith of the Veln Synthesis," she announced. "I am deploying our observation fleet to Earth orbit to bear witness to whatever happens next." She paused, and her voice carried across the galaxy. "Any species that wishes to stand with us is welcome to join." The response was immediate. Counselor Dreven of the Alderi Collective ordered his ships to follow the Veln, and his voice carried something that sounded like pride when he gave the command. The Dremen Confederacy deployed 3 cruisers. The Helix Collective sent 2 science vessels. The Orath Unity dispatched their entire observation wing. Within hours, 47 ships from 12 different species held position around Earth, and they broadcast their presence on every frequency, and they waited. Fleet Commander Vorath stared at the viewscreen and watched the alien ships arrive one by one, and his tactical officer turned to face him with confusion on his face. "Commander, the Council fleet is positioning themselves between our weapons and the planet," he reported. "If we fire now, we will destroy them as well." Vorath's hands clenched on the armrests of his chair. "They are bluffing," he said. "They will withdraw before we fire." But the Council ships did not withdraw. They held their positions, and they broadcast their presence, and the entire galaxy watched and waited. A communications officer approached, Vorath with a tablet in his hands, and his expression carried barely concealed panic. "Commander, we are receiving reports from Dominion territories across the sector," he said. "Rebellions have broken out on 17 worlds that we conquered in previous campaigns." Vorath spun to face him, and his eyes were wide. "What rebellions?" The officer swallowed hard before answering. "The resistance movements on the Conquered worlds have coordinated their uprisings, and they are using tactics that our analysts identify as human in origin. He paused and his voice dropped to a whisper. The humans made contact with the subjugated populations months ago, and they have been sharing their methods and organizing cells, and now those cells are activating simultaneously across our empire. Vorath turned back to the view screen and stared at the blue and green world that had caused so much destruction. The humans had not just been fighting for their own survival. They had been spreading their rebellion like a disease. New transmission from Dominion Command. The communications officer reported Supreme Commander. Karth's face appeared on the view screen, and his expression carried defeat. Fleet Commander Vorath, you are ordered to withdraw all forces from the Earth system immediately, Karth said. Rebellions across our territory require immediate military response, and we cannot afford to lose any more soldiers to that cursed world. Vorath opened his mouth to protest, but Karth cut him off. This is not a request, Commander, and the extinction. Weapons will not be fired while Council ships are in the target zone, because we cannot afford to make enemies of the entire galaxy while fighting insurgencies in our own territory. The transmission ended, and Vorath sat in silence for a long moment. Then he gave the order to withdraw. The Keth fleet turned away from Earth and engaged their faster-than-light drives, and within minutes, they were gone, and the blue and green world remained intact beneath the watching eyes of the Council fleet. Ambassador Yeon Sumin addressed the Galactic Council one final time. She stood at the speaking platform where she had stood 3 months earlier and asked them to watch, and now she stood there, again as the representative of a world that had survived. On behalf of humanity, I thank the Council for bearing witness to this conflict. She said, your presence in our hour of greatest need will not be forgotten. She paused, and her eyes moved across the assembled delegates. I also offer a warning that I hope you will take seriously. Her expression hardened and her voice carried across the chamber with absolute clarity. Humanity has now seen how the galaxy fights, and we have studied your tactics and your weapons and your weaknesses. She smiled, and the expression held both warmth and steel. We have taken very detailed notes, and we will be ready next time. Councillor Drevin rose from his seat, and his 4 arms spread wide in a gesture of respect. Ambassador Sumin, the Aldori Collective, formally requests a military exchange program with Earth. He said, we believe there is much we could learn from your people. Other delegates voiced similar requests, and within hours, humanity had received more offers of alliance and cooperation than any newly recognized species in galactic history. On Earth, the survivors emerged from their hiding places and looked up at a sky that no longer held enemies. General Park Jinho walked through the ruins of Seoul and stopped at a mass grave where thousands of civilians had been buried after the Keth bombardment. A young girl approached him and placed a single flower on the grave. What happens now, General? She asked. Park looked at the flower and then at the construction crews that were already beginning to clear rubble in the distance. Now we rebuild, he said, and we prepare. The girl looked up at him with curiosity. Prepare for what? Park smiled, and the expression carried something ancient and fierce. For whatever comes next. The galaxy had watched humanity fight for survival, and they had seen something that would haunt them for generations. They had seen a species that did not know how to surrender. They had seen a world that treated death as a weapon. They had seen the face of a people who would burn the universe itself before accepting defeat, and they were afraid, because somewhere in the rebuilding ruins of Earth humanity was already planning for the future, and they had taken notes, very detailed notes. The halls of the Keth Dominion High Command had never been so quiet. Supreme Commander Korath sat at the head of a long table surrounded by his most senior advisors and military strategists, and every one of them stared at the casualty reports, as though the numbers might change if they looked hard enough. 2 months had passed since the invasion of Earth began. 340,000 Keth soldiers were dead or missing. They had killed an estimated 12 million humans in the same period and destroyed countless cities and reduced entire regions to rubble and ash. And they were losing. Explain this to me, Korath said, and his voice was calm in a way that made everyone in the room flinch. We deployed 70% of our ground forces to a single primitive world, and we possess complete orbital superiority, and we have weapons capable of ending all life on that planet. He picked up a tablet displaying the latest tactical reports and threw it across the table. And yet we control nothing. One of his advisors cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that trembled slightly. Supreme Commander, the humans have adapted to our tactics faster than any species we have ever encountered, and they exploit weaknesses in our formations that we did not know existed. Another advisor added his assessment with equal reluctance. They have also begun using our own weapons against us, and captured Keth rifles and armor and vehicles have been modified and distributed to resistance cells across the planet. Korath's hands clenched into fists and his sharp teeth ground together. I received a report this morning that a Keth firebase was overrun by human forces. He said, a fortified position with 3,000 soldiers was destroyed by an attacking force of fewer than 500 humans. He turned to face his senior military strategist. How is that possible? The strategist pulled up a recording from the observation drones that the Galactic Council had deployed, and his hand shook as he manipulated the controls. The footage showed the Keth firebase from above, and it was indeed a formidable position with defensive walls and automated weapons, platforms and overlapping fields of fire. Then the attack began. Humans emerged from tunnels that had been dug over weeks right beneath the firebase's perimeter, and they came up inside the defensive walls where the automated weapons could not target them. The attackers moved with a coordination that defied their lack of formal military training, and they struck the command center first and disabled communications before the defenders could call for reinforcement. But what happened next was the part that made Korath's blood run cold. A Keth soldier had captured one of the human attackers and was attempting to interrogate her, and the recording showed a woman who appeared to be barely out of adolescence with blood on her face and fire in her eyes. The Keth soldier demanded that she reveal the location of her command structure and the names of her leaders and the plans for future attacks. The woman laughed. Then she triggered an explosive device that she had hidden in her clothing, and the blast killed her and the Keth soldier and 40 other. Keth, who had been standing nearby Korath, watched the recording 3 times, and each time he focused on the woman's face in the moment before the explosion. She was smiling. They do not value their own lives, he said quietly. Our entire military doctrine is built on the assumption that rational actors will choose survival over death when given the option. He turned to face his advisors, and his expression was haunted. But these humans treat death as a weapon, and they wield it against us without hesitation. The door to the chamber opened, and a communications officer rushed in with a tablet clutched in her hands. Supreme Commander, we have received a transmission from the Galactic Council, she said. Ambassador Yeon Sumin has requested an audience with the full council, and she is making a public address. Korath gestured for the transmission to be displayed, and Sumin's face appeared on the main screen. She looked exactly as she had 2 months ago when she stood before the Vavere Council and asked them to watch, and her calm expression had not changed, despite the millions of her people who had died since then. Members of the Galactic Council, Sumin said, I come before you today to offer my gratitude for your continued observation of the conflict on Earth. She paused, and her eyes seemed to look directly through the screen at Korath himself. The recordings you have gathered will serve as valuable historical documents for future generations, and they will show the galaxy what happens when a species refuses to accept subjugation. Sumin's expression shifted slightly, and something hard appeared in her eyes. I also come before you with a simple message for every species represented in this chamber. She clasped her hands behind her back and stood straighter. Any civilization that provides humanitarian aid to Earth during this conflict will be remembered as a friend of humanity, and we will carry that friendship forward for as long as our species exists." Her voice dropped lower, and the warmth faded from her tone. "And any civilization that provides aid or support to the Keth Dominion will be remembered as an enemy of humanity, and we will carry that memory forward for as long as our species exists." Korath watched as several council representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats and exchanged nervous glances. One of them raised a manipulator limb and spoke in a voice that carried disbelief. "Ambassador, Sumin, your world is currently being invaded, and your people are dying by the millions, and yet you speak as though you are in a position to make threats." Sumin smiled, and the expression held no warmth at all. "I am not making threats, counselor," she said. "I am making promises, and humans always keep our promises." She paused, and her smile widened. "Ask the Keth how well our promises have been kept so far." The transmission ended, and Korath sat in silence for a long moment while his advisors watched him with expressions of growing concern. "She is bluffing," one of them said finally. "They are a primitive species on the verge of extinction, and she speaks as though she expects to win." "Does she?" Korath asked quietly. He pulled up a tactical display that showed the current state of the invasion, and the map was covered with red zones indicating areas of active resistance and orange zones indicating contested territory, and only a handful of green zones showing areas under stable Keth control. "In 2 months we have lost 340,000 soldiers," he said. "Our supply lines are constantly disrupted, and our command posts are vulnerable to attack. And our soldiers are afraid to sleep because the humans come for them in the darkness." He turned to face his advisors, and his expression carried something that looked like despair. "We are the Keth Dominion, and we have conquered 47 worlds, and we have never known defeat." His voice hardened. "But I will not sacrifice our entire military to claim a world that refuses to be claimed." He stood and moved to the tactical display and entered a command code that made everyone in the room gasp. "Deploy the extinction fleet," he ordered. "If we cannot have Earth, then no one will." One of his advisors rose from his seat with horror on his face. "Supreme Commander, the Council is watching, and if we destroy Earth with planet-killing weapons while the galaxy observes, we will be branded as monsters. We are already monsters to the humans," Korath replied. "And I would rather be a monster who wins than a monster who loses." He turned to the communications officer. "Send the order and tell the fleet to charge the extinction weapons, and inform Fleet Commander Varth that he has 6 hours to withdraw his ground forces before we reduce that planet to ash." The officer saluted and hurried from the room, and Korath turned back to the tactical display. Somewhere on that blue and green world, 12 million humans had died, and the survivors were still fighting. He wondered if they would still be fighting when the extinction weapons fired. He suspected that they would, and that thought terrified him more than anything else. Councilor Myrith of the Veln Synthesis had watched the footage 17 times, and she still could not understand what she was seeing. 3 weeks had passed since the Keth invasion began, and the observation drones that the Council had deployed were transmitting continuous feeds from across the planet, and every military analyst in the galaxy was struggling to make sense of the data. She sat in her private office on Varantos Prime and pulled up another recording and watched as a Keth patrol moved through what appeared to be an abandoned village. The soldiers advanced in perfect formation, and their weapons swept across empty buildings and quiet streets, and everything seemed normal until one of them stepped on a hidden pressure plate. The explosion killed 3 soldiers instantly and wounded 4 more, and before the survivors could react, gunfire erupted from a farmhouse that sensors had confirmed was empty just moments before a single human emerged from a hidden cellar and fired 6 shots and disappeared back underground before the Keth could return fire and by the time reinforcements arrived, the human was gone and the patrol was dead. Myrith paused the recording and studied the human's face in the frozen frame. She was a woman who appeared to be past middle age with gray hair and weathered skin, and she moved with the efficiency of someone who had been fighting for a very long time. The Keth had estimated that Earth's military numbered approximately 15 million soldiers across all national forces. After 3 weeks of invasion, they had revised that estimate upward to include every human capable of holding a weapon. The door to Myrith's office opened and Counselor Drevin entered with his 4 arms hanging loose at his sides and his expression carrying something that looked like exhaustion. "You have been watching the footage again," he said, and it was not a question. "I cannot stop watching," Myrith replied. "Every recording shows something new, and every analysis raises more questions than it answers." Drevin settled into a seat across from her, and his massive frame seemed somehow smaller than it had been 3 weeks ago. "The Alary Military Academy has been studying the human tactics," he said. "They have written 14 separate reports, and every one of them concludes the same thing." "Which is?" Myrith asked. "That humans do not fight like any species we have ever encountered," Drevin said. "They do not follow standard military doctrine because they do not have standard military doctrine, and every human seems to operate as an independent unit capable of making tactical decisions without waiting for orders from a central command." Myrith nodded slowly and pulled up another recording that showed a different aspect of the invasion. A Keth battalion had secured a hospital in a coastal city, and they had taken the medical staff prisoner and established a command post in the building's upper floors. The footage showed the Keth commander addressing his troops and explaining that the hospital would serve as a forward operating base for operations in the surrounding area. The next morning, every Keth soldier in the building was dead. The observation drones had recorded everything, and the analysts had watched in stunned silence as the human medical staff who had been held prisoners simply rose in the middle of the night and killed their captors with surgical instruments and stolen weapons and their bare hands. One nurse had strangled a Keth soldier with an 4-tube while her colleague distracted him with questions about his wounds. A doctor had used his knowledge of alien anatomy to locate vital points that even the Keth themselves did not know were vulnerable. By dawn, the hospital was back in human hands, and the medical staff had resumed treating wounded civilians as though nothing had happened. "How do they do this?" Drevin asked quietly. "How does a species with no military training produce individuals capable of such violence?" Myrith switched to a different display that showed a document that researchers had compiled over the past 3 weeks. "I requested a complete analysis of human evolutionary history," she said. "What I found was disturbing." Drevin leaned forward, and his 4 eyes focused on the data scrolling across the screen. "Earth is what xenobiologists classify as a death world," Myrith continued. "The planet's conditions are extreme. By galactic standards, with high gravity and a toxic oxygen atmosphere and temperature variations that would kill most species." She highlighted a section of the document that listed Earth's native predators, and Drevin's expression shifted from curiosity to horror. Humans evolved alongside creatures that hunted them for millions of years, Myrith said. They survived ice ages and plagues and natural disasters that would have driven most species to extinction. She paused and pulled up another image that showed human historical records. "But the most significant factor is this," she said. "Humans did not just fight predators and survive disasters, and they also fought each other." The image displayed a timeline of human conflicts, and the numbers were staggering. Wars that killed millions and famines that killed more, and genocides and conquests and revolutions that stretched back to the very beginning of human civilization. They have been at war with themselves for their entire existence as a species, Myrith said. They have developed weapons and tactics and strategies for killing each other that no other species in the galaxy has ever imagined. Drevin sat back in his seat, and his forearms crossed over his chest in a gesture that no longer seemed dismissive. The Keth assumed they were invading a primitive world with no military capability. He said slowly, "The Keth were wrong," Myrith replied. "They invaded a world where every individual has inherited 200,000 years of survival instincts and combat adaptations." Her console chimed with an incoming transmission, and she opened the channel to find a Council intelligence officer on the other end. "Council and Myrith, we have intercepted a priority communication from the Keth fleet," the officer reported. "Fleet Commander Vorith is requesting reinforcements from the Dominion homeworld." Myrith and Drevin exchanged glances, and something passed between them that did not need words. "Transmit the recording to my console." "Myrith," said the officer, complied, and Vorith's voice filled the room and even through the translator. His tone carried something that neither counselor had ever heard from a Keth commander: fear. "This is Fleet Commander Vorith requesting immediate reinforcement from Dominion Command," the recording said. "Current ground forces are insufficient to secure planetary objectives, and casualty rates are exceeding all projections." There was a pause in the recording, and when Vorith spoke again, his voice was strained. "The humans do not fight according to any known military doctrine, and they do not surrender when faced with overwhelming force, and they do not break when we destroy their cities." Another pause. "They use our tactics against us, and they learn from every engagement. And they share information through networks we cannot locate or destroy." The recording ended with a final statement that made both counselors sit in stunned silence. "I am requesting reinforcements not to achieve victory, but to prevent total loss of the invasion force, and I recommend that Dominion Command begin preparing contingency plans in case this campaign cannot be salvaged." Myrith turned off the console and stared at the blank screen for a long moment. "He is afraid," she said finally. Drevin nodded slowly, and his expression carried something that might have been respect. "The Keth have conquered 47 worlds, and they have never requested reinforcements, and they have never spoken of contingency plans." He stood and moved toward the door, and paused with one hand on the frame. "I believe I owe Ambassador Suman an apology," he said. "She asked us to watch, and I assumed we would be witnessing a tragedy." He turned back to face Myrith, and his four eyes glittered with something new. "Instead, we are watching something else entirely, and I am not certain I have words for what it is." Myrith thought about the nurse with the foretube, and the doctor with his knowledge of anatomy, and the old woman with her 6 shots and her hidden cellar. "I believe the humans have a word for it," she said quietly. "And what word is that?" Drevin asked. Myrith smiled, and the expression felt strange on her face. "They call it war." The Galactic Council stared in disbelief when the invasion of Earth began. Part 1. The chamber fell silent when Ambassador Eon Suman walked through the massive doors and took her place at the speaking platform in the center of the room. Woe species had sent their representatives to Varanthos Prime for this emergency session, and all of them turned their various eyes and sensory organs toward the small human woman who stood before them with an expression that none of them could read. Counselor Drevin of the Aldery Collective leaned forward in his hovering seat, and his forearms crossed over his chest in a gesture of impatience that was universal across the galaxy. "Ambassador Suman," he said in his rumbling voice, "you requested this emergency session with claims of urgent intelligence regarding the Keth Dominion, and we have gathered as you asked, so please explain why we should concern ourselves with matters involving your small and isolated world." Suman pressed a button on her console, and a holographic display appeared above the chamber, showing a fleet of warships that stretched across the void of space like a swarm of metal insects. 3 days ago, our deep space sensors detected this armada entering the outer reaches of our solar system, she said in a voice that carried no fear and no desperation. 400 warships of the Keth Dominion are currently on approach to Earth with an estimated arrival time of 72 hours. Murmurs rippled through the chamber and several delegates exchanged glances that carried a mixture of pity and resignation. Councilor Myrith of the Vone Synthesis raised one of her delicate manipulator limbs, and her bioluminescent skin flickered with colors that indicated concern. Ambassador, we offer our sympathies for the situation your world faces, but I must ask what you expect the Council to do about this matter. She said, the Keth Dominion has conquered 47 worlds in the past 3 centuries, and their military doctrine is considered flawless by every strategic analysis we possess. Another delegate spoke up from across the chamber, and his translator rendered his clicking speech into words that everyone could understand. Earth possesses no orbital defense grid, and no military fleet, and no planetary shields. He said, your world achieved interplanetary travel only 60 years ago, and you have yet to develop faster than light capabilities without assistance from Council species who provided the technology as part of first contact protocols. Sumin nodded slowly, and her dark eyes moved across the assembled representatives with an expression that several of them would later describe as unsettling. You are correct, she said. By every metric that the Council uses to measure military capability, Earth is defenseless against a Keth invasion force. Councilor Dreven spread his forearms wide in a gesture of finality. Then I failed to understand the purpose of this emergency session, he said. The outcome is predetermined, and while the Council extends its condolences to your species, we cannot intervene in a conflict where the result is already certain. He paused, and his expression softened slightly into something that might have been genuine sympathy. I would suggest that the Council begin preparing refugee accommodations for whatever survivors the Keth choose to spare. He continued, it is the least we can do for a species facing extinction. Several other delegates nodded in agreement, and the chamber began to fill with the low hum of side conversations as representatives discussed the logistics of humanitarian aid for the aftermath. Sumin stood perfectly still at the speaking platform and waited for the noise to die down before she spoke again. I did not come here to ask for military intervention, she said, and I did not come here to request refugee status for my people. The chamber fell silent once more, and Councilor Myrith tilted her head in confusion. Then what do you want from us, Ambassador? She asked. Sumin smiled, and it was a smile that made several of the more empathic species in the room feel deeply uncomfortable without understanding why I want you to watch. She said. The silence stretched for several long seconds before Councilor Dreven let out a sound that his translator rendered as a dismissive laugh. You want us to watch your world burn, he said. Is this some form of human ritual that we are unfamiliar with, or perhaps a cultural practice surrounding death that requires witnesses? Something like that, Sumin replied. I am formally requesting that the Galactic Council deploy observation drones to Earth's solar system to document everything that happens over the coming weeks. Councilor Myrith exchanged a glance with several other delegates, and her bioluminescent skin flickered with colors that indicated deep uncertainty. This is an unusual request, she said. May I ask why you want your species' defeat recorded for posterity? Sumin's smile widened slightly, and she clasped her hands behind her back in a posture that radiated calm confidence despite the circumstances. Because I want the galaxy to see what happens when someone invades Earth, she said. I want every species represented in this chamber to have access to unedited footage of the conflict so that there can be no dispute about the events that will unfold. Councilor Dreven shifted in his seat, and something in Sumin's tone made his forearms uncross and moved to grip the armrests of his chair. You speak as though you expect a different outcome than total defeat, he said slowly. I speak as someone who knows her own people, Sumin replied. The Keth have conquered 47 worlds, and I have studied their campaigns in great detail, and every one of those conquests followed the same pattern. She pressed another button, and the holographic display changed to show a series of planetary maps with military movements traced across their surfaces. The Keth arrive with overwhelming force, and they destroy orbital defenses, and they land ground troops to secure population centers, and within days the target world surrenders because the cost of continued resistance becomes too high. She switched off the display and turned to face the assembled delegates directly. But the Council has never seen what happens when a species refuses to calculate the cost of resistance. She said, "You have never witnessed a world that treats invasion not as a military problem to be solved, but as an insult to be answered." The chamber remained silent, and Sumin could feel the weight of 12 species staring at her with expressions ranging from pity to confusion to something that might have been the first stirrings of curiosity. "Deploy your observation drones," she said. "Watch everything that happens, and keep your records, and share them with every world in the galaxy." She paused, and her smile faded into something harder and colder. "Because when this is over, I want every species in the Council to understand exactly what kind of neighbors they have been living next to for the past 60 years. Councilor Marith's skin flickered rapidly through several colors before settling on a pale blue that indicated reluctant agreement. "The Velm synthesis will deploy observation drones as requested," she said. "If nothing else, it will provide valuable data on Keth military tactics for future reference." Other delegates voiced their agreement, and within the hour the Council had authorized a full observation network to be established around Earth's solar system as the session ended and delegates began to file out of the chamber. Councilor Drevin approached Sumin and stood before her with his forearms folded across his chest once more. "I do not understand you humans," he said. "You face certain destruction, and yet you stand there smiling as though you know something that the rest of us do not." Sumin looked up at the towering Allory, and her expression revealed nothing. "Perhaps we do, Counselor," she said. "Perhaps we do." She turned and walked out of the chamber, and as soon as she was alone in the corridor, she activated her secure communication device and transmitted a single coded phrase to Earth Command. "They are coming, and they will be watching. So show them everything." On the other end of the transmission, a general received the message and smiled the same cold smile that Sumin had worn in the council chamber. The preparations had already begun. Fleet Commander Vorath stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the blue and green world grow larger on the viewscreen with every passing minute. He had conquered 11 worlds in his career, and each victory had added new medals to his uniform and new respect to his name among the Keth Dominion, and this 12th conquest would be the easiest of them all. Status report. He commanded, and his voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had never known defeat. His tactical officer consulted the sensor displays and turned to face him with an expression of barely concealed boredom. "No orbital defenses detected, Commander, and no military satellites, and no shield generators, and no weapons platforms of any kind," the officer reported. "The planet appears to be completely unprotected." Vorath allowed himself a small smile, and his sharp teeth glinted in the bridge lighting. "As expected," he said. "These humans achieved space travel only recently, and they have had no time to develop proper defenses against a superior force." He turned to his communications officer and gestured toward the planet below. "Open a channel to the surface and broadcast our standard terms of surrender," he ordered. "Inform them that resistance is futile and that compliance will result in favorable treatment for their population." The message was sent, and the fleet waited in orbit for a response that never came. After 1 hour, Voreth's patience ran out, and he gave the order that would begin the invasion. "Deploy all ground forces," he commanded. "Standard pacification protocol for all major population centers, and I want this world secured within 6 hours." Dropships launched from every carrier in the fleet and descended through the atmosphere like a swarm of metal locusts. and they carried 50,000 of the Keth Dominion's finest soldiers toward 12 major cities across the planet's surface. The first wave landed outside a sprawling metropolis that the humans called Sol, and Commander Dreth led his battalion out of the dropships and onto the foreign soil with his weapon raised, and his soldiers spreading out in perfect formation behind him. The city stretched before them, and its towers reached toward the sky, and its streets were empty and silent in a way that felt wrong somehow. Forward advance, Dreth ordered. Secure the central government district and establish a command post. His soldiers moved through the empty streets, and their armored boots echoed against the pavement, and nothing happened, and nothing moved, and the silence grew heavier with every step. 17 minutes passed, and Dreth began to wonder if the humans had simply fled at the sight of the invasion force and abandoned their city without a fight. Then the ground exploded beneath his forward scouts and swallowed them whole. Dreth spun toward the sound and saw nothing but smoke and debris. And when the dust cleared, there was only a crater where 6 of his soldiers had been standing. Contact. Someone screamed over the communication channel, and then the scream cut off and the static gunfire erupted from every direction at once, and Dreth watched his soldiers fall one by one to enemies they could not see and weapons they could not locate. A sniper round punched through the helmet of his second-in-command from a distance that should have been impossible, and by the time his soldiers turned to return fire, the sniper was gone. Fall back to the dropships, Dreth ordered, but when he turned around, he saw that the dropships were burning. Humans emerged from manholes and basement doors and windows that had seemed empty moments before, and they carried weapons that ranged from military rifles to improvised explosives to farming tools sharpened into blades. They struck fast and they struck hard, and then they vanished back into the buildings and tunnels before the Keth could organize a proper response. Drellied what remained of his battalion and attempted to establish a defensive position, but every building they entered was rigged with traps, and every street they crossed was an ambush waiting to happen. The same story repeated itself in every city across the planet. In Moscow, the Keth secured a government building, only to discover that the entire structure had been wired with explosives that detonated the moment the last soldier entered. In Cairo, they pushed into the city center and found themselves surrounded by tunnels that stretched for kilometers beneath the sand, and human fighters who knew every twist and turn in Snow Hollow. They captured a residential district and discovered too late that the residents had not fled but had simply hidden in basements and attics and walls, and emerged at night to slit throats in the darkness. Fleet Commander Varath received casualty reports that made no sense, and his tactical officers struggled to explain how a primitive species with no military fleet could be inflicting such losses on the finest soldiers in the galaxy. Order orbital bombardment of the city called Sol. Varath commanded through gritted teeth. Reduce it to ash and show these humans the price of resistance. The flagship's weapons charged and fired, and the city burned, and when the smoke cleared, the Keth expected surrender. Instead, they received a transmission from deep underground and was broadcast on every frequency across the planet. A child's voice singing a song in a language the translators could not fully process, but the meaning was clear enough. We are still here, and we are not afraid, and we will never stop fighting. Varath stared at the burning city on his view screen and watched as human resistance fighters emerged from tunnels outside the bombardment zone and began attacking his ground forces once again. How many did we kill? He asked quietly. His tactical officer checked the reports and swallowed hard before answering. Estimated civilian casualties in Sol exceed 2 million, Commander, he said. And how many of our soldiers did we lose in that city before the bombardment? Varath asked. The officer paused, and his voice trembled slightly when he spoke. Approximately 4,000, Commander, with another 2,000 wounded. Varath did the math in his head and felt something cold settle in his stomach. For every Keth soldier killed, the humans had lost 500 civilians, and yet they showed no signs of surrender and no indication that they would ever stop fighting. Deploy reinforcements to all sectors, he ordered, and increase bombardment protocols for any zone that shows organized resistance. But even as he gave the order, he knew that something was wrong, and something was different about this world and these people. He had conquered 11 worlds, and every one of them had broken eventually, and every one of them had calculated the cost of resistance and decided that survival was more important than pride. These humans did not seem to make that calculation. They did not count their dead and weigh them against victory. They simply kept fighting as though the concept of surrender did not exist in their language. A communications officer approached Vorath's command chair, and his expression carried something that looked almost like fear. "Commander, we are intercepting human transmissions from across the planet," he reported. "They are coordinating their resistance through underground networks that we cannot locate or disrupt." "What are they saying?" Vorath asked. The officer hesitated before answering. "They are sharing tactics, Commander, and celebrating their kills and promising each other that they will make us pay for every meter of ground we take." He paused and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Some of them are laughing, Commander, and they are laughing at us." Vorath turned back to the view screen and stared at the planet below, and for the first time in his long career, he felt the cold touch of doubt. This was supposed to be an easy conquest. This was supposed to take 6 hours. It had been 3 days, and he had lost 12,000 soldiers, and he controlled nothing at all.